Professor Fenton, tell us what you've been thinking about these last few years during the COVID episode, and where things stand now. What lessons learned? What should we have known in advance?
Well, right from the beginning of COVID, I mean, fairly early on anyway, I think probably as early as March 2020, we were looking at the publicly available data, which was relevant to the infection fatality rate. How deadly was this new awful virus that was spreading around the world? And we said straight away, and we even published stuff fairly early on, saying that this was nothing like as deadly as was being claimed. I mean, there's an interesting, something I didn't realize actually about this until recently from a political aspect, is that it was all about this. There was this claim of a 3.4% infection fatality rate, i.e. that over 3% of people who would get the virus would die from it. And of course, people were sort of accepted that there were differences in different age groups. But I didn't realize that, I mean, we knew that people were claiming higher infection rates. I didn't realize until recently that that was a figure that Donald Trump actually tried to ridicule, and which he was ridiculed intensely
for ridiculing it,
attempting to ridicule that figure. Right now, in fact, I saw some interesting clips of people literally ridiculing Trump for daring to question that 3.4% infection fatality rate. Of course, we now know that it was way lower than that. I mean, it was essentially no worse than a bad flu season. We're certain about that now. And in fact, in most, other than the extremely elderly, for which there are, I think, other reasons why there was a higher fatality rate, the infection fatality rates were lower for most people than a normal flu. But it was interesting that he was so challenged so ferociously on that figure. And that was where, I mean, I always knew there was a kind of like a political narrative behind this. There were so many different political events, if you like, happening, which, if you like, supported or were contributing to an idea amongst, let's say, a certain political class that they wanted to make this thing a bigger thing than it necessarily was. I mean, another interesting political aspect from this, which again, I was reading a book by Avi Yamini, his autobiography. And of course, I knew this. Again, this was quite well known at the time, but I'd completely forgotten about it. That he was reporting on the phenomenal demonstrations that were going on in Hong Kong in January of 2020, December and January of 2020, which looked where you had like 2 million people, right? Sort of 40% or whatever of the population of Hong Kong actually out on the streets demonstrating against the the regular, essentially becoming more a formal part of China than they had been. They wanted to retain some level of distinction. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese, of course, started clamping down massively, but they couldn't stop it. Of course, COVID miraculously came along for them at just the time to completely stop those, demonstrations stone dead. So, and then you had this political backlash against Trump, who was kind of aware, more aware than most people, that maybe this thing was being exaggerated. But no, he had to be closed. He had to be closed down on that. And I think that there was definitely an attempt to. That was definitely part of an attempt to then move towards the mail-in ballots, which ultimately did for him at the 2020 election. So
absolutely.
Yeah, so you're still there. So there was we were initially we were reporting on that, and then later on we were doing work on showing that the PCR tests were producing far more false positives than people understood. So people were seeing people said, well, there's only, the false positive rate is only 1%. So people think that only one out of every 100 people who don't have COVID will wrongly test positive. But this is a misunderstanding. There's a basic misunderstanding, mathematical fallacy involved in that. In fact, the true number of people, the number of people who are actually falsely testing positive depends on the prior infection rate. And what we saw was that if you're testing a lot of asymptomatic people, then actually both theoretically and empirically, you would get something like 80% of people who were testing positive were likely false positives. And there's all kinds of other issues about the way the PCR testing was done as well, which lead to us even now questioning that even more. So you had all that, but it was always about, in that period from that sort of late summer of 2020 to the late autumn of 2020, it was about making sure that the crisis, that in terms of the number of PCR cases was being seen to be growing ever more. We'd had the outbreak in March, nothing much was happening over the summer, and suddenly with the mass testing of asymptomatics, you were creating in Europe and in the USA this new, apparently exponentially increasing number of COVID cases. And of course, that meant not only renewed lockdowns, but also that the only way out of the lockdowns was going to be the miraculous vaccine. And so that was all, I think, politically motivated. The maths basically didn't support the narrative that the mainstream media and the health authorities were telling everybody. And of course, we know that there was no long-term safety data or testing of the vaccine. And we saw very early on, in January of 2021, immediately after the vaccines were rolled out in the UK, we were already seeing a small amount of evidence of a peak in all-cause mortality in the vaccinated, as for each different age group, as it was being rolled out to its peak. There were these small peaks, which we believe were due to a slight increase in all-cause mortality in those shortly after vaccination. That's been later been borne out by subsequent data. And of course, raising any of these issues, all of these issues were challenging the narrative, both the health narrative and the political narrative. So from that, I was basically ostracized. I was cast out from the sort of scientific community because I and a small number of colleagues were the only people kind of mathematically, statistically trained, let's say, who were actually countering the official narrative about this deadly virus and this safe and effective vaccine.
Well, thank you for that, first of all. It takes a certain kind of bravery, and it's a remarkable thing that more people didn't. I'm always wondering, what is, whether we actually have science, whether we actually have mathematics, whether we actually have medicine, or we have groups, kind of guilds. I remember reading about the Hanseatic League and guilds of the Middle Ages and so forth, and wondering about that. And I didn't really have a sense that we had guilds in the modern age, but I think we do. Just as a side note, kind of a point of personal puffery here. I did have a piece that I wrote early on in the pandemic. I couldn't get it published anywhere. I got it eventually in American Thinker, which is not a huge magazine, but it's a thoughtful one, as the name might imply. And I wrote, is universal testing a universal good? And I remember, maybe not everybody does from medical school, the 18th century Presbyterian minister Thomas Bayes' theorem, pointing out that you couldn't, you're not going to get accurate testing if you test people with in low endemic areas. You're going to get a lot more false negatives. Excuse me, a lot more false positive than you would otherwise. And I go over this kind of thing. Like if you're, running an airport, bomb sniffing device or whatever, and you run it in Omaha, Nebraska, or Baghdad, during the Iraq War, where are you going to find when people are more likely to be stuffing in bombs, you're going to, whenever you have a positive test, it's more likely to correlate with an actual bomb. And obviously, we all know that you go through these metal detectors and you get pulled aside in line at the airport. There's very low likelihood any of those people have a bomb, but they get pulled over. So we were familiar with the concept of false positive, but for some reason we didn't transmute this or transport it to the realm of coronavirus testing. And I think there's a lot of bleed in coronavirus testing itself, as we've seen with the various versions like Omicron currently, which is not even necessarily a branch of SARS-CoV-2. There's some debate on that. And today we see that people turn positive when they have Omicron. It's not SARS-CoV-2, which has long left the scene. So I think the testing itself was maybe somewhat misrepresented as encompassing specifically the SARS-CoV-2 virus, when it may very well have bled over into common cold coronavirus, such as it existed, for the duration of humanity. I think coronaviruses probably precede humans on the Earth, and they're probably
In actual fact, my colleague Professor Martin Neal, just talking to him this morning about this, because he's doing some new work on the PCR testing, and he's actually got some real evidence using the official text on how they were doing the original PCR testing, and he's actually showing that when you take account of sort of cross reactivity, i.e., the possibility that these PCR tests will show positive just on an ordinary cold or earlier or other types of coronavirus, that the claim false positive rates actually are even higher than wherever discussed. So the problem is even worse than we imagined. And so
I concur with that. And
all of this fits in now to helping explain why there was that incredibly large number, those high numbers of.
We're testing healthy people. Cases. We're doing it without symptoms. In medicine, there's a thing called case finding, where you have somebody come in for one problem and then you hunt for something else.
Yeah.
And that's all well and good. You get somebody in for their cold and you want to make sure they don't have something, whatever. If they're a certain age, you check for prostate and this and that. But what we were doing here was we were redefining what cases were. Historically, a case of tuberculosis, say, would mean you have the illness. Yeah. Here we were defining cases of coronavirus for people who had no symptoms, and we were just defining it by this test, which I think was a false signal in large regard.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got, just go back to, of course, it was Bayes' theorem that we were using to explain this stuff. I mean, if you've got a situation, which we had here over a long period when we were actually looking at a lot of the real empirical data, we knew that we had some real data that amongst people who were asymptomatic, I didn't have any symptoms during quite a long period, only about 1 in 1,000 of those would actually go on to become ill and have, the genuine virus, as it were. So what you've got is this sort of base rate of 1 in 1,000 asymptomatics who really don't have the virus and aren't going to go on to get it. They haven't got, they're not hiding it in any way. They really haven't got it, right? Only 1 in 1,000. Well, if you've got a test which, let's say, has only a 5% false positive rate, meaning that every 100 people who don't have it, 5%, 5 of those are going to test positive, then, of course, in every 1,000 people who are asymptomatic you're testing, one of whom will probably have the virus, but about 50 who don't have the virus are going to wrongly test positive. So that's where you can get these very high. You get this very high, basically. Yeah. Only 2% of the people who are testing positive actually have the virus. So people just didn't understand that. Politicians don't understand.
I think it's difficult to bring to the public. I've been to lectures on Bayes' theorem, and it was like the first time I heard it in lecture was actually after medical school. Maybe I heard it during, but it was astoundingly brought to my attention by Professor Michael Barry, who's local here in Boston, Mass General, and he had taught me at Rochester as well as a resident. And it's an astounding thing. I try to run, I make analogies, and the analogy I make for people to try to conceive of this is if you were like a plant detector, you detect green plants, And so maybe you're only a 12-year-old kid and you try to identify green plants. That's part of your school project for the day. So you're in New York City indoors, running around lobbies and whatnot, and you point at plants and you assume they're all real. And then you're outdoors in Miami, Florida, and looking at green plants. Well, they all look like green plants, mind you, but there's a certain aspect of being a plant which have to be alive and whatnot. And if you're in New York City lobbies, a fair fraction of them might just well be artificial plants. And they look like plants, and they're planted there, I guess, in both senses of the word. And if you just look at them cursorily and just try to decide which are which, you're going to have a much higher false positive rate of identifying plants in New York City indoor lobbies and offices than you would outdoors in Miami or even indoors in Miami, because plants grow much better there. And so when you have a higher rate of endemic positive biologic marker, such as plants in Miami versus plants in New York City indoors, you're going to have different rates of your test being validated. The test in this case being a 12-year-old looking at them, and deciding what it is. And that's kind of what is, I think, a difficult concept. It was never brought up. I watched, I don't watch the news, but secondarily I parsed through it. I never saw anybody mention Bayes' theorem in terms of testing at the time, and it's a huge matter because at the various cusps of an infection, early on and late in the phase, when the endemic rate goes down, you're going to have higher rates of false positives. So you're going to have a harder time deciding it's real at the beginning, and you're going to have a harder time turning it off at the end.
Yeah, but this is it. They don't understand. The politicians don't understand it. I mean, we had discussions with politicians. You get politicians say, look, we've got these results from the labs. We know, they'll say, that the false positive testing rate is only 2% or 3% or whatever, right? Well, yeah, that's a fact. But as I just explained my example, that's irrelevant. What matters is the underlying base rate of the infection rate, because the lower that is, the higher the number of actual false positives you're going to get from the same test.
Yeah, and I think it sounds like magic to other people. I think people just assume these things when something's 99% safe. They have an assumption. I don't think people really understand, even though you're a professor of it. I don't think they understand stratified risk. And I don't think they understand comparative risk and orders of magnitude and different risk.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing, that this difference between, relative risk and absolute risk. So, when the often quoted one was with the original, the Pfizer, when they were claiming the 95% efficacy rate for the
vaccine,
for the Pfizer vaccine, and people were pointing out, but the absolute risk, it only changed it by about 1%. Well, that's true, but of course, what we now know is that 95%, even 95% relative risk claim was complete rubbish. It just wasn't true. And this is the other thing that we've done extensively in terms of using kind of like simple statistics. It's not, I wouldn't even call it anything sophisticated. Is that by the way they do the efficacy and safety testing for these vaccines, right, was essentially fraudulent, because they, as soon as you start to classify people, if you decide that people shortly after vaccination, say within 7, 14 or 21 days, it varies according to different studies, but typically they'll say we don't classify them as vaccinated until after 14 days after vaccination. So anybody who gets infected within 14 days of the vaccination is treated as an unvaccinated case, as well as all the genuinely unvaccinated ones. And that simple trick, which we call the cheap trick, is guaranteed to get you these 95%
I think
efficacy claims.
Lewis Carroll had the same kind of thing in through the Looking Glass, maybe, where Alice, something's not. I forget who it is in Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, that something's not so unless he says it's so. Do you remember that?
I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. I'll have to pause on that. But Charles Dodgson was also a mathematician. And he's pointing out, but a lot of these things were not, There's also the quote, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. I'm not sure who
Yeah.
said that. But
Yeah, that
a
was, yeah.
lot of statistics seem to have been weaponized. Maybe you could, as an expert, kind of sift through the various statistics that were put upon us that might fall into one of those first two categories.
Well, we've already seen the fatality rate. That original 3.4%, whereas it's closer to whatever over the whole population, less about 0.2%, and even that's exaggerated because a lot of those deaths, which were classified as COVID deaths, were actually iatrogenic in the sense that, especially with the older people who were in hospital with COVID, they were not given. I mean, in many cases, you had the situation where they get the bacterial pneumonia as a result of a virus like COVID, and then they're denied the sort of standard antibiotic treatments. You've got that type of thing happening. You've got the do not resuscitate thing. You've got people being given remdesivir in the UK, midazolam, which are basically, they're essentially encouraging and
they're dying
their end of life
with COVID, not necessarily from COVID.
Yeah, and so you've got that. There was, let's say, the complete misunderstanding about what a false positive test rate means, and these massively exaggerated efficacy claims for the vaccine, both effectiveness and safety, which are usually stated as sort of over 90%, but it's just a statistical illusion in most cases. You are guaranteed, if you take a placebo, or even something which is worse than a placebo, you get the same effect actually. I.e., it's even worse in the sense that people taking it are more likely to get infected than people who don't. If you do that trick, the misclassification trick of counting people who get the disease, who get infected shortly after vaccination as being unvaccinated, then you're guaranteed to get these 95, start off with these 95% effectiveness. In fact, what we do is we simulated all this in exactly the type of ramp up of vaccine when you ramp it up, let's say starting from a low percentage of the population to say 85, 90% of a particular cohort get vaccinated. They get vaccinated with a 12-week period, which is what was happening in most places. So, for example, in the UK, in the first few weeks of 2021, all those aged over 65 were vaccinated. In fact, you got to within 3 months, you did really have about 85, 90% of them vaccinated. Then you go on to the next age group down and do it over that period. What you'll see is in each age group, you'll see the same thing happening. You'll see these really peaks of effectiveness. It looks really effective at first. It lasts for a few weeks, and then it basically tapers out, right? Well, that's just an inevitable statistical artifact of this misclassification. You'd see exactly the same thing, as I say, with a placebo. But of course, it fits perfectly again into the narrative, which is that, after 3 months, you need a booster. And of course, you get the booster, you do the same cheap trick again, and you get the same thing happening. Oh yeah, it does. Getting the booster does suddenly, apparently, decrease your chances massively of getting infected.
Just to put a fine point on that, you're saying that because they don't classify you as as vaccinated until a certain time after the vaccine, maybe just kind of repeat the point to me. How this kind of engenders the need for a booster. Please, I apologize.
Yeah, so what happens is that in the first 2 weeks, all of those who had been vaccinated, who get infected, are classified as unvaccinated. So in those first 2 weeks, the only people who are getting infected are the vaccinated. Are the unvaccinated.
Because they are not called vaccinated, even though they got a shot.
They're classified as unvaccinated because they haven't got to the 2 weeks yet.
Mm-hmm.
So you move on a bit further, and some of those who were who were vaccinated more than 2 weeks ago do now get infected, and they are classified as vaccinated infected. Okay, but because you're because you're pulling this vaccine out to the whole population, in each period, a lot of people who are getting vaccinated within 2 weeks who get the infection are still counted as unvaccinated, right? And so you're still getting this massive bias, right, as you're rolling the vaccine out, of the people, most of the people who are classified as cases. A lot of those are classified as unvaccinated, even though they were vaccinated, but not 2 weeks before.
So you're basically putting your hand on the scale.
And it tapers off. When does it taper off? It tapers off at the point when most people are already vaccinated, because at that point, you're not getting any new people being vaccinated, wrongly classified as cases because they've been vaccinated in 2 weeks. You're getting the real figure. So when you've essentially vaccinated everybody, you get down to the real situation, which is that people are either vaccinated or they're unvaccinated. And if the vaccination was not effective, you'll see the same rates in each, which is what happens, which is basically where you eventually come down to this.
Lo and behold, they did this other trick of saying you're not fully vaccinated.
Yeah, look, they do it in all. It's a simplification, because they'll say, oh no, we make a distinction. We'll do a separate effectiveness figure for the partially vaccinated and the not fully vaccinated. But in most cases where they give the efficacy figure, it's what they call fully vaccinated, right? So if you are only able to have had the first dose, you're fully vaccinated after the 2 weeks, right? But if there's a second, if you're eligible for a second dose, even if you're vaccinated, 3 months before, you'd still be considered not fully vaccinated.
Right. So
and here's an interesting. I'll get to some other great figures, right? Which really, what was happening was so they roll out the vaccine 2021, of course, right? And people start to realize that, first of all, you talk about cognitive dissonance. I mean, a friend of mine's elderly father was one of the first to be given the vaccine. And very beginning of January 2021, died within 24 hours. Okay, he was an elderly man, but he was, hadn't had it. He wasn't, there was no indication he was about to die. And of course, absolutely, you could not question, the idea you could question the family on this. They absolutely rejected, because there's that sense. Part of it is that, well, they probably encouraged him to get the vaccine. They've been told by everybody this is 100% safe and effective. So they can't countenance the idea that the vaccine could possibly have had anything to do with this. And I saw that type of behavior over and over again. So later on, I had another, other friend who had been cleared of, was in remission of cancer, got the booster, and within a few weeks they were dead. They had the turbo cancer. So but again, nobody. The families were absolutely adamant that you were an absolute nutcase for even raising the possibility that the vaccine might have played any effect to that. But nevertheless, enough people were seeing serious adverse reactions from the vaccine in 2021. And by then they were certainly seeing that the effective argument was rubbish, because the only people at that point who were getting COVID more than once were the ones who had been vaccinated, especially the double vaccinated and the boosted, right, by autumn of 2021. So everybody saw that. That was known. Of course, you couldn't speak about it publicly, but people with their own eyes, your own real world experience, even people who were absolutely adamant that this vaccine was the greatest thing since sliced bread, realized that it's probably not going to stop us from getting COVID. So what happened was that the government, they started to see that by then, I think at the end of 2021, I think they already had a fourth booster out, but there was certainly the second booster, the fourth jab. When they brought out the booster in late summer, early autumn of 2021 in the UK. And they were seeing that actually people suddenly, whereas you got this quite a high, lots of people, most people did get who eligible got vaccinated early on. People weren't really keen on taking the booster because, they saw this evidence with their own eyes. Maybe they felt that, what's the point? So what happened then is you had this massive campaign was launched, which was repeating the following mantra, because they'd already realized that the vaccine, people knew the vaccine wasn't going to stop them catching COVID. The mantra was, if you get the vaccine, and only if you get the vaccine, will that stop you being hospitalized and dying with COVID. So that was the message. That, unbelievably, that is still a message. That is still a narrative they try and push today, because they know they lost on the effectiveness one. So they go for this one where it might not stop you getting COVID, but you're not going to get it anything like as bad as the unvaccinated. It's only the unvaccinated who are going to be hospitalized and dying with COVID. And there were these figures pushed out about 90%, they were saying, in autumn of 2021. It was in the UK. I saw they also were doing it in the US as well. But in the UK, it was a massive thing. The NHS were putting out things. The BBC were putting out this 90% of people in hospital and dying with COVID are unvaccinated. It was all part of this campaign to scare people into making sure they got boosted. We showed it was completely and utterly false. For a start, on their own admission, right, when you got into it with the freedom of information request and all of that data was, when they were talking about vaccinated, it was the fully vaccinated, which actually meant with the booster. So even the double vaccinated who've been double vaccinated for a few months were classified, were put into that unvaccinated category. So they were lying. They were openly lying, because they were talking about, well, if you read the small print in some of these, they do say we meant fully vaccinated, not unvaccinated. So you had all that. But there were lots of other aspects to this scam, because we got hospital data. We got this data from a number of hospital trusts, where we got the full data on people who had actually died in the hospital and whether or not they had the vaccination status. And most hospitals, up until June of 2021, did not record a single death of a let me get this right. So that every single person who was recorded as dying was classified as unvaccinated. Irrespective, this is all causes. Every single person up until late June of 2021 in almost all hospitals in the UK was classified as unvaccinated. Why? Because the National Immunisation Management System, which was holding the data on vaccination records, hadn't released the information to the hospitals. So they were simply they had no record. Most of these people actually were vaccinated, of course. Because they didn't have a record in NIMS, unless they were recorded as vaccinated in that particular hospital, they were classified as unvaccinated. We've actually got the spreadsheets. We can see they are classified as unvaccinated, even though it's simply unknown, and most of them were vaccinated. And we know that when they published this 80-90% unvaccinated dying with COVID, etc., in hospital in autumn of 2021, they were basing it on that kind of data. So it's not surprising that you're going to get those figures. All complete, absolute fabrication. And to this day, I mean, do you know anyone do you know any unvaccinated person who has been hospitalized or died from COVID?
Do I know any unvaccinated who have
since the vaccines were rolled out,
who have died?
Yeah.
No.
Right, and yet they're telling us that the only people dying,
right?
They're telling us there's still been plenty of people dying from COVID.
Yeah. No,
they're saying that they must all be unvaccinated.
I think it's again, it's too bad I can't remember the character in Alice in Wonderland, but it's pretty much they call it what they want to, and when it's not what they want to, they still call it what they want to.
Yeah, I mean, you got to remember there was also the other con was about the definition of who dies with COVID. So in the UK, I think it was even worse in some US states, actually, because in the UK, anybody who died within 28 days of a positive PCR test was classified as a COVID death.
Right.
So if you, and even if you went, and you also classified as a COVID hospitalization if you'd had a PCR test within 2 weeks before, any 2 weeks before you were hospitalized, irrespective of the reason. So if you broke a leg, right, and you happened to have tested positive 2 weeks before, you were classified as a COVID hospitalization, right? And anybody who went into hospital for any reason, right, and got COVID in hospital, which a lot of people did. A lot of people went in for different reasons and then got the infection, you know, got tested positive whilst they're in hospital. Then any of those who died, of course, were classified as COVID deaths.
Yeah.
You know, I always liken this to...
I mean, without sounding too morbid, it's a little bit reminiscent of what used to be classified as being black, and during the Nazis as being Jewish. You know, if you there are all these terms, the mestizo and mulatto, and if you had, you know, a drop of black blood, you were considered black. If you had a drop of Jewish blood, you were considered Jewish. You know, everything was bent over backwards in a system where you want to find the thing you want to find.
Yeah.
And you want to eradicate this one thing, and you go about it, you know, monomaniacally, with deleterious effects and tragedy abounds and all that kind of stuff. But in this case, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my analogy is a bit like the Hotel California with this PCR positive. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. It's always, it just stays with you.
Yeah, I think we call it the Roach. You know, you call them Roach motels. You know what a Roach motel is?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you can go in easily enough, you can't leave. So let's see where we segue.
So many of these scams. I mean, they're probably. I mean, we've been reporting. I mean, we got our Substack with every few days we report on yet another sort of flawed study. I mean, they are desperately trying to even now maintain that narrative with increasingly desperate and ludicrous studies which repeat all of these same systematic flaws.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even right from the start, I mean, one of the craziest ones which got us into, which really revealed a lot about the sort of scientific corruption as well, was the first really big study on a population-wide study, interesting enough, was the Pfizer study that was done in Israel, which was done on most of the population. I think they had like 4.5 million medical records. This was published in the Lancet in May 2021. And this was the first population-wide study which bragged that that 95% effective figure for the Pfizer vaccine was borne out in practice. It wasn't just from the relatively small randomized controlled trial, which is a relatively small number. Here, it's rolled out to almost the entire population, and they claim they can tell by looking at comparing the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, you get the 95% effectiveness figure. And that was published in Lancet to great acclaim. And that was, in a sense, that's what sealed the deal. You know, that was it. There was no debate anymore. This is you know, this vaccine is 95% effective, right? And that we immediately, as we weren't the owners, but we were the ones most prominently pointing out obvious flaws in that study, including you got the miscategorization flaws, but there was another really unbelievably terrible, ridiculous trick they pulled in that one, which was that the unvax, because of course you're looking at all those classified as cases, as COVID cases, and deciding whether, you know, are they vaccinated or are they unvaccinated. That's what you're basing your effectiveness figure on, right? Well, it turns out, of course, the unvaccinated in Israel at that time, and that was about, I don't know, it was about less than 500,000, so a small proportion, but still quite a large number of those in the study. Because they were unvaccinated, they were forced, if they wanted to, you know, go to work or even go into a mall or anything at that time, they were forced to take PCR tests, right? In fact, we know they were 6 times more likely than a vaccinated person to have to take a PCR test, right? Well, if you're comparing two populations where one of them is 6 times more likely to take this flawed test, which is likely to give false positive, then when you count the number of unvaccinated or considered as cases, it's going to be massively inflated. And that's going to, of course, contribute massively to this so-called 95% effectiveness. So now, it wasn't the only, there were other problems with the study, but these was just some of the obvious ones. We pointed all this out, wrote to the, what should have been, they should have published these so-called fast response letters in the Lancet, where if you point out a flaw in a study, it should be, they never published it, right? They said they were sending it to the lead author. And the lead author basically refused to reply.
Right. And that just becomes a dead letter.
So we followed this up a few times. They said, "Oh, well, we're still researching it." So that was May 2021. January 2023, so over 18 months later, I get a letter from the Lancet saying, "We apologize for the long delay in a decision about your letter, but we have decided that because the lead author did not respond to your complaints, we cannot publish your letter." It was weird. So I thought this was kind of like sort of a little bit humorous, right? Because we found out a lot more about that lead author. I won't go into details now. It's all on our Substack if you search for sort of the Lancet study. But I simply copied it was an email, the editor's email, and put it as a tweet on Twitter. And within 24 hours, it had 1 million views, that tweet. And lo and behold, and of course, the Lancet were tagged into that. And obviously, a lot of people then started to reply to the Lancet about what the hell is going on here. And lo and behold, less than 24 hours later, I get another email from the Lancet saying, "We really apologize. We made a mistake in this case. And actually, we invite you to submit your letter again. We'll submit whatever revisions you feel are required." So we did this very, very quickly. We did just did a slight update to the letter. And we included some other interesting details about the lead author, which were in the public domain. So there was nothing scandalous. No, it was 300 words. That's all it was. And within 24 hours of that, we got a letter back saying we've decided not to publish it after.
Oh, my God.
To publish it. Yep. So to cut a long story short, I did a freedom of access, not freedom of information request, because you can't do it. It's the relevant one, which is about access to my personal, where they've got personal details of me. Subject access requests in the UK, it's called. So you can ask for all correspondence, which is I asked for all correspondence with all of the editors about this submission with my name on it. And it's quite incredible because I got back quite a substantial document over 9 pages, almost all of it redacted, but enough of it not redacted to see that they were saying things like, "Well, we can't publish this because he's a conspiracy theorist or he's a anti-vaxxer." And of course I put all that on the Substack as well to embarrass and show people what so-called peer-reviewed scientific literature. And the Lancet, of course, is the most prestigious medical journal that there is, and yet this is how they behave. Absolutely corrupt, disgusting people.
It's a sadness. They never followed through and published you, did they?
No, they didn't.
You have to repeat tweets. Clearly, the political pressure of the tweet, 1 million responses and so forth, or reposts, would get their attention. But whether they are objective science types or political toadies is self-evident.
Well, as I said, what I found out, this is true, incidentally, I've been increasingly talking about this in relation to the climate science as well, because I have some sort of background in that area as well. And increasingly, I'm totally convinced that most of these people who call themselves scientists in these areas are political activists above being scientists. So yeah, I've seen that all the time. It's political activism which is driving this. They are committed. They feel that they feel that they are prepared, that they're prepared to lie for what they see as the greater good, because they're so convinced that what they're doing is important. So for the climate scientists,
I agree. I've got two. I'll try to make them really quick anecdotes, but one is a fairly close relative of mine. Went to journalism school and acted as a reporter and whatnot. And at one point he was between jobs, and there was a great story that he could cover based on his own experience. He was at Columbia for decades, and Barack Obama had been at Columbia. There's no stories on there's like a total vacuum of Barack Obama stories about his time at Columbia. Total negation. I said to my close relative, I said, here's a story you could do. You're between jobs. You could write a little, thing. I'm sure it'd get published in New York Magazine, whatever, and so forth. It could even be a book. He's like, there's no way I would do that. I said, well, you're out of work. This is a great topic. Nobody's covering it. He's got decades of Columbia contacts. He went to Columbia Journalism School. He lived at Columbia, etc., for like 20 years. Anyway, he said, I said, why wouldn't you do that? He said, well, you don't understand what journalism is. And he added an epithet to it. You ignorant fool. I said, well, okay, tell me what journalism is. He says, well, journalism is making, basically stamping the progressive message.
Yeah.
And this would put us in danger if we found out things we didn't want to hear about Barack Obama. We would kill the greatest hope for progressivism. Blah 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 blah. Okay, fine. So that's journalism. A. B. I had a very similar but much smaller episode with JAMA, JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, which is prides itself on being one of the top 3 or 4 journals of that type on earth. And I was in conference with the 2 erstwhile chief editors, Howard Bauschner and Edward Livingston, in early 2020, because I had just a short article on the disappearance of the Zika microcephaly phenomenon. It was there, it was gone. It was there in 2015 and never even repeated in 2016, even though we coughed up $1 billion in the U.S., so forth. And it spurred a whole Zika research industry. It went from like a total of 0 articles before 2008 to like thousands currently. Anyway, so Dr. Livingston was the more medical type, and he was on a Zoom call with me and said, I find your article quite fascinating. I don't find it, there's nothing I can really refute in it. And my point is basically Zika is real, and microcephaly is a real phenomenon. Zika is a real virus, but it just so happens A doesn't cause B. Not revolutionary. I'm not a conspiracy guy. I'm looking at the data, so forth. And he said, I think we'd like to publish it. And I remember feeling this little, moment of joy. And he said, but, which took it away. He said, but this is the wrong time to do it because we don't want to sow any doubt in the public health establishment with coronavirus brewing and on the horizon. It was early 2020, like February or something like that. And I'm like, dude, I didn't say, this is your job to sow doubt across the board, public health establishment, wherever. I mean, that is the I mean, I didn't say this quite this way. I tried to be polite about it, but I'm like, that's your job, is to adjudicate the science. Let the pieces fall where they may. And that's the whole point of debate and whatnot. He says, yeah, you might be right, but no, we're not going to do it. And this coronavirus thing should blow over in a couple of weeks and we'll publish your thing. Yeah. Well, years have gone by and he wound up having to commit, cancel culture harakiri. He laid upon his sword for something he didn't do, totally different. And so did Bauschner, because Livingston committed the grave crime of saying that he as a doctor didn't see race when he saw patients. He knew what race they were, but he didn't treat them any differently based on the race. He's like, I don't know what kind of surgeon he is, but he would take out their gallbladder and the insides were all the same color. whatever he said in some podcast, and it got mischaracterized in the title of the podcast as saying doctors can't be racist or something like that. They misquoted him, and Bouchner defended him based on the misquote, and they both had to resign ultimately.
So I heard about that story,
and that had nothing to do with my little voodoo doll.
No, exactly. That they are, these journalists and these editors of the science journals, they are pushing a narrative rather than the science. That's for sure. I mean, I'll finish with one relevant anecdote to that. I'll trump you on the Obama one, right? Because actually, the very first time I ever wrote an article on a blog, it was even before we had a Substack, I was doing a sort of a blog, but I ever wrote anything which was in any way could be conceived as political, was way back. I mean, Obama was president by then, right? But he was, not. I don't think he was that long into his term. But there was a discussion. There was an interesting debate about whether his book had been ghostwritten by a particular. I can't remember. It was by what's his name? Was it Bill Ayers? That one.
Yeah, Bill Ayers.
People had looked at the similarity indexes, right? And I thought, what, this is actually quite. I think someone had done sort of a Bayesian analysis, right? I didn't think it was very good, so I sort of redid that Bayesian analysis on that, and I actually didn't come to the conclusion that the book was ghostwritten, but I think I had enough. I put something that there were certainly doubts that it could have been, something like that. I got simply for doing that this was seen as potentially casting any doubt on the integrity of the greatest man who's ever lived and was going to be the savior of all mankind. The ferocious attacks I got from other senior members of statistical profession was phenomenal. From the Royal Statistical Society, absolutely incredible. I was blown away by that.
It's a sadness. Basically, this is where all this veers into religion.
It's a religion. It is a religion. Yeah. Climate change religion. I mean, COVID became a religion.
Yeah, no, they're different.
Net zero, net zero and climate change run the same thing.
They're different books, but they all have the same, basic response, which is, kind of the solid solidification and sclerosis of government and taking away individuals' proclivities and rights and responsibilities and so forth. Despite how poorly government does at many things. I saw a recent meme that said, if the carbon tax can help, clean up the earth and reduce climate, could you please get me a pothole tax or, a violent crime tax? Can we start, getting violent crime neutral? And why don't you get rid of that?
Exactly.
On a mathematical basis, I put this out to my climatism friends, but basically, making heroin illegal did not get rid of heroin. There's a black market for it, and even as methadone became into existence and made, all the drug dealers did was made their heroin more efficiently, and the prices went down. I can pretty much document every time there's a greater move to treatment and an introduction of, say, Suboxone, methadone, whatnot, adding, basically pseudo narcotics or, treatment narcotics to the brew, the heroin dealers never go away. They just get more competitive. They get, leaner and meaner. And the price of heroin street value in real dollars or real pounds, keeps going down and it jumps down every time we introduce something to get people away from it. So my question is, if you made, carbon, fossil fuels, or whatever, oil and gas or petrol illegal, all of a sudden they wouldn't take away the fact that they are very energy dense, useful, mobile means of powering. And all you would do is heroinize these items, and they wouldn't make them go away. You'd still be using them, except certain countries would be doing it and passing electrons from place to place instead. I don't. It doesn't seem like that is any kind of manageable plan.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely nonsensical. I mean, this is going to be my next drive is to. I've started to expose the ludicrous aspects of this whole net zero thing, but now that sort of COVID's died down, that that'll be the next thing on my
There,
agenda.
there seems to be no end of mathematical clarity attempts at these little
Yeah.
phantasm. People are, it's kind of a charlatan aspect. People just misuse, and they work and they prey on fear and panic. And that seems to be a very potent way. So as we're rounding out the hour, what are Professor Fenton's recommendations for the populace, and what are the messages we need to take away from this? And if you really care to expound on it, I'm just curious about your use of the deer hunter to discuss probability and risk assessment.
Well, that was just an example I was using, which is highly relevant to the whole sort of COVID era. That it's no good talking about risk and probability without also talking about utility. So the example I gave there was that if you looked at the classic scene in The Deer Hunter where Robert De Niro went for this apparently ridiculous 3-bullet game, which would seem like it was certain to have him killed, and yet that was his way out effectively. That when you look at the probabilities there, the probability that he would have succeeded in his plan is incredibly low. It's an incredibly low probability, but compared to the utility of it not succeeding, they were almost certainly going to die anyway, right? Maybe it would have just taken a bit longer till the next game or whatever. It was a perfectly rational thing to do, right? So the thing about COVID, think about the lockdowns. They were all they were thinking about was they were only thinking about the probability of something bad happening from COVID. Lots of people get infected. They never ever considered the alternative risks of the lockdowns and the bad effect of that. So it's all about balancing out risk and utilities, and that doesn't ever seem to be done. You only get one side of an argument. So you need to look at the probabilities of all the outcomes and the utilities of all the outcomes in order to understand what is the optimal decision to make.
Well, I like that. So I'm going to recommend people follow you. I have you here at normanfenton.com.
Or on Where Are the Numbers is the Substack.
You have another. Okay, fair enough. I'm not sure I have that up right now, but I think if they pop here, they can probably
it's linked to it's there.
Find you there. And you are on X as Prof. N. Fenton. People, and I find your feed fascinating. You have risk assessment and decision analysis with Bayesian networks, and that's referencing our good friend, the Presbyterian minister Thomas Bayes, I think 18th century or so. You have actually written the book on that here on Amazon. And so we'll assume you know what you're talking about. As a mild note of quasi self-promotion, again, I kind of recommend people look at my article from the Daily Skeptic of over a year and a half ago. Is it time to accept that Omicron is not COVID-19? This is a math problem here. Since you're a math professor, what is 2024 minus 2019? I think that's about 5 years away. And viruses mutate. And I see people still wearing masks. I was at the chemist. What do you call the chemist? The pharmacist yesterday. And all the staff are wearing their masks officiously, and as if that's doing anything. And I'm enough of a pain. I don't go out of my way. I won't stop people on normal byways and whatnot. But she was getting my stuff and she was clicking things in. I had a second to ask her, and I tried to refine the question. Maybe you can come up with a better one. But I'm like, so I don't want to say, why are you wearing it now? I say, are you planning on wearing a mask 5 years from now? So I picked that as a reasonable time away from the present. They're like, oh no, I wouldn't be doing that in 5 years. I don't have any plan of doing that. Like, oh, how about? And then I picked, and they meet. How about 2 years from now? I don't think so. Why would I be wearing this in 2 years from now? Like, well, how about what's the thing that's going to happen between now and 2 years that's going to change your mind? And then that makes them like nothing has happened in the recent past. and nothing's going to happen between now and 2 years. And I don't know. It's just kind of a funny thing. But Omicron was probably never, even necessarily a SARS-CoV-2 descendant, and we're still going nuts over it in the same manner. I just think it's kind of a reasonable cudgel by which people can do this. By the way, I think it was the Red Queen that has this fanciful way of looking at things. But that's I'm not going to be. Maybe one of our listeners can come up with it. And then just as a final note of self-promotion, if people want to help support my video cast, they can buy my book. It's on Zika. It's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's a fascinating item. There's some math in it, but it's written for the general public, and it's just an amazing thing. They predicted 1 million cases of microcephaly, additional microcephalic babies per year. There are some. It's like one in a 1,000 kind of thing happens anyway for the history of mankind, and probably all animal kind, except those animals with microcephaly don't live. We tend to support our young with the abnormalities, but they predicted 1 million extra cases per year. It never happened, and the whole industry has never retracted, recanted, reformulated, anything. The original hypothesis, which for my taste would mean it's a bad hypothesis. But anyway, there you have it. That's what we have for science these days. Fortunately, we have people like Professor Fenton taking up the actual Lancet to pierce some of the egregious boils of excess amongst our scientific literate bourgeois.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks.